Thank you very much, Bette Gordon, to be here with us today. You did a master class for the Department of Arts and New Media. And I wanted to ask you a few questions about what you said. I would like you to tell us a little bit about your beginning.
When I began to make films, well, of course, I talked about living in Paris and having a kind of moment of seeing everything that I could see in a city that is basically cinema, right? Paris equals cinema because you have a little tiny cinema everywhere, every corner. And although my background was in the history of cinema and looking at films over the course of the decades from silent cinema on, when I began to make films and I was in the United States, I was more experimental in the beginning part of my career. And I think that the art world in New York City was a very influential place to be. In the 70s, I still lived in the Midwest where I went to college, but we were given a kind of map of so many experimental films that were being made across not only the United States, but also in Europe, a kind of real study of cinema as art. And in the same way that a painter or a sculptor would work with the material that is not necessarily representational, that it didn't have to be an image, but you could work with the materials themselves. It was a very powerful time, I think, in the world of art, maybe coming out of abstract expressionism, where it wasn't about the image at all. It was really about the kind of combination of things, whether it's the color or the shape or the design, using almost a kind of collage-like way of putting images together. So in film too, we as young filmmakers were interested in getting away from what we thought was commercial and trying to find a language in the art environment in which we were living. And that is really what I did in the beginning, was to really find out what is this thing called film, not even cinema, film. Like what happens when you put film in a camera? What can you do to the image and with the image to make people aware of the medium itself, not so much the story? And it was just a kind of period of freedom in terms of exploring this time and space-based medium. What could you do to get the viewer to think about film as a plastic material? Maybe it was just light, or maybe it was just sound, or maybe it was this idea of 24 frames per second, and what did that mean? So those were the early films. But as I had this background in cinema history, I never left my history. I never really left my great love of the traditional historical films and what I had taken with me. And so eventually I came back, even though my films always were strongly image-based. I think when I returned to the more narrative form, it was a kind of return to what made me want to study cinema in the beginning, going back to Godard, going back to Breathless.
Actually,
Yes.
You said that Breathless changed your way of looking at cinema and gave you a new start.
Yes, and I think I didn't know it when I saw it. You know, when you have an experience sometimes, you're moved, and I didn't have the language even when I was 16 years old or 17 to really say what it was that affected me so deeply, but I knew it was different. I knew it was a new door, and it was something that I'd never seen before, a way of telling a story, characters that I had never seen portrayed that way, and this kind of freedom of using Paris as a character, and I wanted to go through that door. It's only later, as I began to understand what kinds of movies Godard was making and learn about the French New Wave, and then I understood what it was about. Always, no matter how many films he made that were stories, they were also always essays that made you think about subjects, whether it would be La Chinoise or Weekend or Tu vas bien, Je vous salue Marie. You really felt the sense of a filmmaker who was thinking deeply, not only about the characters in the story, but the world in which we live, and speaking directly to the viewer. And remember, we take away from Godard truth at 24 frames per second without really knowing what that meant, but it was all about how we would then go on to interpret that truth, which for us, maybe at that time, at that moment in history, and you know, in terms of who we were as a group of young filmmakers, it really made us conscious and aware of the possibilities of the medium. Not just as entertainment, but as something more. And that's what Godard taught us.
You actually met Godard and interviewed
Yes,
him.
yes.
Can you tell them?
Oh my God, it was amazing. You know, you don't often imagine that you get to, I mean, you can go to lectures, and I'm sure that I heard him speak, but I had been living in New York. I'd made Variety. I was partly friendly with a editor of a magazine called New York Talk, and she had gotten the permission from the New York Film Festival of having filmmakers interview the directors who were coming to be at the New York Film Festival in that year. Maybe it was 1986, and in that year Godard was there, the Taviani brothers, I forget who else that year, and so there was a group of about 5 or 6 of us that the editor knew, and she was in the position to let us choose. Of course, I was the first one to go, and I said, I want to interview Godard. And so it was a gift. It was wonderful, and I prepared for days. I was nervous to meet the person who had affected me the most, but I also wanted to be prepared. I'm always prepared when I do something. I never, you know, don't allow myself a thought process. So I stayed up all night. I had my questions. And it's funny, but often when you, and I've done interviews with other directors since then, you walk into a hotel room, and there you are in a room, and the room has a bed. And of course, the movie that most affected me, Breathless, has a great scene of Jean-Paul Belmondo and Jean Seberg in bed. And it's where he uses the jump cut, which we talked about as a kind of device that he became sort of known for as disrupting the conventions of editing. And I saw the bed and I said, you know, would it be possible for you to let me interview you instead of in the chair on the bed? And he said, why not? Pourquoi pas? And so we have this incredible picture. There was a photographer there, and he's sitting on the bed, sort of leaning, and I'm sitting on the bed, kind of leaning, and it's a kind of moment. I can't even remember what I was feeling. I'm sure I was incredibly nervous, but I knew that if I could get through this, I would have something that I would treasure for a long time after. And so, and he was very nice with me. He can be, as I've understood, a very tough person, but in this situation, we were really talking about the movie itself, and there was a lot of protest for this movie that reimagined Jesus and Mary. Jesus was pumping gas, and Mary was driving her car, and so it was controversial for the Catholic, you know, people, the church, and there were protests. So I took it very seriously, and I think he appreciated that. And I don't think I asked stupid questions. I think I was very thoughtful in terms of my approach, and he answered all my questions, and we published the interview. And to this day, I cherish, you know, the memory of that, but I also have the photograph to remind me of that moment in my life. It's good.
When you say that film is more than a story, oh, it's not just a story.
Yes.
What do you mean?
I think I mean that it's a text, that it says more. It has something underneath that it wants to say. It's not necessarily you, the director, that wants to say it, although you do, that it is a live text, and it certainly is there to be a story. Let's take the last film that I made. A thriller is always a great story because you're on the edge of your seat and, oh my God, what's he going to do? What does he want? Is this boy ever going to go away and leave him alone? And so you're engaged, and that's the level of the story. But underneath, what does it really mean? I think the film is really more about every person is made up of, I called it a Jekyll and a Hyde, or this rational part of your makeup and this libidinal with no thought. What if in one character, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you have that person, but are you not more than what you think you are? I mean, what is human nature after all? Those are the questions that we hope that when we make the story, we hope the viewer will think about more than just being entertained by a complex character or an exciting story, that what's underneath that story is sometimes something that sometimes the director is not all that conscious of it. You know you have an idea, but when you put images together, they, like Eisenstein said, A plus B doesn't necessarily just equal A plus B, but it's the conjunction of these images and shots that should make the viewer go beyond just staying with the screen. It's, I call it the subtext, of course, but it's also, for me, I remember hearing Harold Pinter's Nobel Peace Prize speech, and he talked about that mirror, and that it was the obligation of every artist and every citizen to not just stop at the face of the mirror, but to look beyond it, because we are by nature, we need to be curious. We need to confront things that we think exist and possibly look further. And so I think stories can do that. They don't all, but I mean, even if you take a movie like Jaws, okay, Jaws is a great Spielberg movie, but what is it really about? Is it about invasion? Is it about the unknown? I mean, when you start to think about, there's the story and then there's the level of, you know, what deeper issues that are circulating in the culture that find their way into the stories, or it's even through the visual nature of the medium, like we said before, that putting two things together creates something other than just this image and that image. So I think that's what I mean, and I hope it's not true of all movies in a way, although many movies just maintain the status quo. A boy meets a girl meets a girl, a boy meets a boy, and isn't it great, and it all turns out. But what is that really about? Is it about making people feel good? Is it about promising something that the world can deliver or can't deliver? I think we need to be people who think about stories beyond just allowing them to entertain us. And we don't want our minds to shut off. We want our minds to turn on. But that doesn't always happen. I wish it did.
Yes, I would too.
Yeah.
You said something very interesting for our students. You said a lot of interesting things, but one of them I think is very original for them. You said that they shouldn't look at the world the way people tell them to,
yes.
But they should open themselves
Yes.
to the world.
Yes. Yes.
I think it's wonderful. It's a great lesson.
It is true, and I don't see it all the time in young people. I wish I did. I feel like I came from a generation in which people were very suspicious of what ideas we were given. And maybe that was after World War II, and you know, in the 1950s, there was a kind of acceptance of the status quo, and after that, a kind of period of unrest. And I think it can always happen, but we need to be conscious of, again, it goes back to that idea of not just seeing something that exists on face value, but really examining what people tell us and why they're saying it, and what does it mean for me, you know, as a person in this world, or for my colleagues or my friends. I think it's important to, I think I raised my daughter with one important idea, which is that it's the questions that are important and not necessarily the answers, that you don't always get answers, but you need to keep asking questions. The minute you stop asking questions, you stop being curious about the world, and I feel that there's a kind of passivity. I think passive behavior is something that I find very disturbing. And I always like a kind of an active looking, an active thinking, rather than a passive acceptance. And I try to live by that. It's not always easy, but it keeps me going every day, because I think there's more than what you see.
Yes, we can feel this active feeling that, through your work.
Yes, and the characters, and I want more. I want to know more. Often, as I said, I might not get an answer, but the exploration itself feels rewarding in some way. Yeah.
And to finish our conversation, what would you say to the students who want to follow cinema and filmmaking?
Yes. Right. It's a difficult time because there's so much out there. We have cheaper means of production. We can get a camera. It's not expensive. We have a phone if we need it that has a camera in it. We can always get actors or friends together. But we're in a difficult time where there is so many stories because of the vast, expansive nature of the internet, and now we have so many series on Netflix and Amazon and all the different ways which open up us to so much. And it worries me because with so much, the more we have, the less things start to mean. You go from one image to another image so easily. There's no work that has to be done. You just open up your computer and you click a button. It's not like having to go to a cinema and wait in the line and sort of have this mass experience. So maybe it's becoming so easy that I worry that it doesn't have as much meaning as it used to. So what do we do as filmmakers? I think it's always important to trust that the ideas that you have will be interesting to other people if you completely explore what it is that you want to say. I think you can't make movies imagining that you're going to become rich and famous or make money or have a job. It's not. My sister worked in business and she was very good. And there's a ladder in the corporate world where you start here, and if you're competent, you go here, and if you're smart, you go here, and you eventually have this sort of security. But film is an art, and there's no ladder. I mean, you can be the most talented filmmaker in the world, but you might not have luck. And you need luck. You need to be at the right place at the right time, have the right story for the right moment. So, you know, you can't count on that all coming together. So it has to be from this passion that you have, this idea that you're going to do this no matter what, and you've explored other ways of earning a living so that maybe you can do both, earn a living and still make the films you want to make. And if you're lucky, one thing will come together with the other. And I think many people, when you start out and you're making your first film, many people will say no. They'll say no because they don't even know why they're saying no. Sometimes they're scared to say yes. But if somebody says no and 20 people say no, 100 people can say no. But if you really believe in this, you're going to keep doing it anyway. And there only has to be one yes. And so don't let the the negative and the fear that you won't do it stop you from doing it. So it is a kind of, you have to will. You have to have strong willpower and just the belief that there is something that you want to say, and that there might be, even if there's only 20 other people that end up seeing your film and they're your friends, at least you've made it, and next time you'll have another idea, and maybe one of those people will have been so affected by your work that it will give them an idea, and then they'll make it too. But it's not a ladder. There's no cause and effect. There's no you have to do A, B, C, D. It's an unknown. And if you're afraid of the unknown, it's not a good field for you. But if you have the courage, I think mostly what I think when I say what makes a good film director or a good filmmaker, a lot of things. Courage, stamina to keep going, late hours, a lot of work, the ability to visualize, the ability to work with people, collaborative spirit. But for me, the most important thing that I say is clarity. You have to be clear, I think, about what you want to make. Even if you can't put it exactly into words, you can put it into pictures. You have an idea in your head that has clarity so that you know what road you're following. So all of those things are important, but I think clarity is most important. And then, of course, just the ability to keep going no matter what.